The Supreme Court has made it easier for states to impose life sentences without the possibility of parole for juvenile offenders. We're talking about minors here who might have done something awful, but the whole point here is, are minors redeemable? I mean, they're minors, they're not fully matured yet. But the Supreme Court, unfortunately, with its conservative Supreme Court justices, has decided that no, we should totally throw the book on minors. So the justices, in a 6-3 ruling, rejected arguments by an inmate. His name is Brett Jones, who was 15 years old, by the way, when he stabbed his grandfather to death and was sentenced to life in prison. They disagreed with his arguments that his sentence of life in prison with no chance of parole violated the 8th Amendment because the judge in his trial had not made a separate finding that he was permanently incorrigible. So the point here is, is the minor irredeemable? Right? Can this person be rehabilitated and allowed to be out free to be a productive member of society? And so the point here is, hey, are the judges, or is the judge required to prove that this person is incorrigible? And unfortunately, the conservative justices said, no, they don't even need to really figure that out. So Justice Brett Kavanaugh is the one who wrote the opinion here, and he writes, determining the proper sentence in such a case raises profound questions of morality and social policy. The states, not the federal courts, make those broad moral and policy judgments in the first instance when enacting their sentencing laws. So he's making a states' rights argument there. The kind of discretionary sentencing followed by Mississippi has resulted in numerous sentences less than life without parole for defendants who otherwise would have received mandatory life without parole sentences. And then there's this part that I mean, the whole thing is upsetting, but this is the part that really got under my skin because he's just lying. Jones's argument that the sentencer must make a finding of permanent incorrigibility is inconsistent with the court's precedents. That's a lie. As long as the state considers the youth of the offender during sentencing, no other analysis is required. So I actually want to go to some precedent to maybe remind Justice Kavanaugh. Maybe he was drinking too much beer and doesn't remember these cases. But in a 2012 ruling, the Supreme Court had decided that mandatory life sentences without parole in homicide cases involving juvenile offenders represented cruel and unusual punishment. In 2016, the justices decided that the 2012 ruling applied retroactively, meaning that convicted criminals imprisoned years earlier could then argue for their release. So if you want to talk about precedent, there is precedent. It's just that it doesn't go along with the narrative that Justice Kavanaugh would have you believe.
So they're chipping away at it. So this is how this works, to simplify. So conservatives pretend that they care a lot about precedent because they like some of the old law and they want to keep it. They're not in favor of change. They're conservatives, right? But the problem is some of the old precedent is on our side, and meaning progressive side, et cetera. Then they got to find an excuse, right? So in this case, the court ruled 9 years ago, you cannot give life sentences to people under 18. Now, that's because they're young. It's not because the crime isn't horrific. Sometimes the crime is terrible, right? But you've got kids. Do you think that a 14-year-old, for example, is perfectly mature and knows exactly what they're doing? No, they grow up there. In fact, we know that literally their brains change, right? The connections, the neural connections are not fully formed yet. And so they are quite literally different people identity-wise when they grow up. So that is why the court ruled, as it should, that under the 8th Amendment, it would be cruel and unusual to lock them up for something they did when they were minors, right? So now Kavanaugh and the rest of the conservatives, the 6 that voted in that way, are barbaric, and they don't want that. Like, I don't care if you were an infant. I want you locked up forever and ever and ever and ever because you're bad guys and we need to protect society, i.e. the powerful, the rich, et cetera, okay? Mm-hmm. So in this case, what they're saying is, well, the ruling that the only way that you could lock up someone who was a minor after that Supreme Court case was if the judge just said something extraordinary. They're permanently incorrigible. Like there's no help for them ever. It's impossible for them to get better. Now they're saying, well, do you really need that? You don't really need that. We could still lock them up forever if we use other pretenses. In other words, you're getting rid of the precedent.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and you're trying to find a cutesy loophole to try to get rid of it so you could lock up people forever. And that's definitely what happened. Sotomayor just absolutely leveled Kavanaugh's decision and had a brilliant dissent. Yeah. But to no avail, because there's 6 conservatives on the Supreme Court now. So there's almost nothing you could do.
Let me give you an excerpt of her dissenting opinion. She said, "The court is fooling no one. The question is whether the state at some point must consider whether a juvenile offender has demonstrated maturity and rehabilitation sufficient to merit a chance at life beyond the prison in which he has grown up. For most, the answer is yes." And look, I also want to be clear, the examples, like the cases where a juvenile offender has been sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, these are serious offenses. No one is trying to whitewash that or make it seem like they didn't do anything wrong. No, it's awful. But the question is, do you apply the same standard to a child that you would to an adult, right? Because an adult is a fully formed human being, already matured, brain is developed. The situation is different for children. And so are children really completely irredeemable in all cases where they've been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole? I don't believe that. And neither does Justice Sotomayor.
Yeah, and neither did the Supreme Court until Trump and the Republicans packed it full of conservatives. And now all of a sudden they're like, kids, do we really need them? So now I know there are some grown-ups without fully formed brains either. The guy who appointed those 3. But
God, he appointed 3 of them.
I know, it's unbelievable. Yeah. But I mean, you want to talk about permanently incorrigible? That would be Donald Trump. But for these kids now, well, it's a lifetime in prison for a lot of them because of this decision. No matter how much they changed, and no matter how much they can prove that they changed. Thanks for watching the Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.